Sometimes the worst betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from men you raised like your own sons. Clayton Baird, a respected 58-year-old cattle baron, learned this harsh truth when the outlaws he'd mentored turned on him. They took everything, his horses, his dignity, his good name, and left him bleeding in the rain outside his ranch while their laughter echoed through the storm. For 2 long seasons he vanished into the high wilderness. Folks whispered he'd gone mad or died alone. The truth was far stranger. He survived among wolves, healing wounds both physical and moral. Now he's returned, grizzled and grey, with the entire wolf pack beside him. What happens when you push a decent man too far? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clayton Baird had built his life the same way his grandfather built the ranch house, one careful piece at a time, with attention to detail and respect for what came before. At 58, he'd seen enough seasons turn to understand that wealth meant nothing without character, and power meant nothing without responsibility. These were lessons his father taught him, and his father's father before that, passed down like the silver pocket watch he kept in his vest pocket, checking it with a frequency that had become habit over the decades. The watch had been his grandfather's, carried across the plains in 1849 during the rush to California. His grandfather never found gold, but he found something better, this stretch of land near Dry Hollow where water ran clean and grass grew thick enough to raise cattle. 3 generations of Bairds had worked this soil, and Clayton intended it to be 4, though his daughter Sarah had chosen Denver and a life far from ranching. He couldn't fault her for that choice. Margaret's death 5 years back had cast a shadow over this place that maybe only distance could ease. The ranch house stood 2 stories tall, built from local timber and river stone, positioned on a gentle rise that gave a view of the valley below. From the porch, Clayton could see his herds grazing across 3,000 acres, the fences straight and well-maintained, the bunkhouse where his hands stayed clean and freshly painted. He'd always believed that how a man kept his property reflected how he kept his word. Spring of 1891 had arrived gentle that year, the kind of season that made a man grateful for the life he'd carved from wilderness. Clayton stood on that porch in the early morning, the pocket watch open in his palm. 6:30. The sun was clearing, the eastern hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The air smelled of sage and new grass. Somewhere in the distance cattle lowed, and closer by horses nickered in the corral. "Morning, Clayton," the voice came from the barn, and Clayton looked up to see Wyatt Crenshaw leading his horse out for the day's work. The young man, though at 32, maybe not so young anymore, moved with easy confidence, his hat tilted back, his grin ready. "Morning, Wyatt. You get that fence line checked yesterday like we discussed? Every post, every wire, all secure." Wyatt swung himself into the saddle with practiced grace. "Dutch and Tommy are headed up to the north pasture today. Ray's going to work on that irrigation issue near the creek." Clayton nodded, tucking the watch back into his pocket. "Good. I'll ride out with you to see the cattle. Want to check on those new calves?" Wyatt had come to the ranch 14 years ago, a half-starved kid of 18, with more pride than sense and no family to speak of. His folks had died of fever, and he'd been drifting from town to town, taking work where he could find it and trouble when he couldn't. Clayton had seen something in the boy, maybe a reminder of his own younger self, maybe just the recognition that everyone deserved a chance to make something of their life. He'd taught Wyatt everything: how to rope and brand, how to read the weather and the land, how to gentle a green horse and doctor a sick cow. More than that, he'd taught him that hard work and honesty built a man's reputation, and reputation was the only currency that really mattered in this territory. Dutch Mallory had followed 2 years after Wyatt, another young man with a past he didn't talk about much and a future he was trying to build. Tommy Vickers came 3 years ago, barely 20 then, running from debts in Kansas City. Ray Sutton was the newest, only been with them 8 months. A decent hand when he stayed sober, Clayton had treated them all fairly, more than fairly, if he was being honest. He paid better wages than most ranchers, fed them well, and when times were good, he shared the profits. When Wyatt turned 21, Clayton had given him a hand-tooled saddle that cost more than 3 months' wages. When Dutch needed money to send to his sister back east, Clayton had given it to him without asking for details. He'd posted Tommy's gambling debts to keep him out of jail, and he'd looked the other way when Ray showed up some mornings with liquor still on his breath. Margaret used to tell him he was too generous, that some men would mistake kindness for weakness. She'd been right about most things, his Margaret. 28 years of marriage, and she'd known him better than he knew himself. Her passing had hollowed him out in ways he was still learning to understand. The ranch kept him moving forward, kept him from dwelling too long in the empty rooms where her presence still lingered. Sarah had come home for the funeral, stayed 3 months, then returned to Denver where she worked as a schoolteacher. She wrote him letters every week, careful cursive on good paper, telling him about her students and the city life and asking after his health. He wrote back less frequently than he should, his words always feeling inadequate on the page. He loved his daughter fiercely, but he'd never been good with emotions, never knew quite how to bridge the distance that had grown between them after Margaret died. The ranch was what he had left. The work, the land, the animals, the rhythm of seasons, and the men who worked beside him, or so he'd thought. There had been signs looking back, small things he'd dismissed or explained away, money going missing from the locked box in his office. Not much, but enough to notice if you were paying attention. Cattle counts that didn't quite match up when they should have. Whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into the bunkhouse. The way Wyatt had started looking at him these past few months, something calculating behind those eyes that hadn't been there before. But Clayton had built his life on trust. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in assuming the best until proven otherwise. It was the code he'd been raised with, the values his father had modeled. You didn't accuse a man without evidence, and you didn't turn on people who worked beside you. The dry, hollow community respected Clayton. When disputes arose between ranchers, they often asked him to mediate. When the town needed money for a new schoolhouse, he donated generously. When drought hit 3 years back, and smaller ranchers struggled, he'd helped where he could, sometimes buying their cattle at prices higher than market value just to keep them solvent. Sheriff Hoskins, who'd known Clayton since they were both young men, once said that Clayton Baird was the kind of man the territory was built on, steady, fair, and strong. That reputation had been earned through 30 years of honest dealing and hard work. Clayton had started with 200 acres inherited from his father and built it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. He'd done it without cutting corners, without cheating partners, without crushing competitors. He'd done it the right way, the honorable way, the way his grandfather would have approved of. The morning sun climbed higher as Clayton and Wyatt rode out toward the grazing lands. The cattle were scattered across the valley, red and white hides bright against the green grass. New calves stayed close to their mothers, still unsteady on long legs. It was good land, fed by 3 creeks that never ran dry, even in the hottest summers. Clayton had spent years improving it, building up the herds, managing the grazing to keep the grass healthy. "Fine-looking animals," Wyatt said, and Clayton nodded. "Been a good year. If prices hold, we'll do well at market." "You've done well every year," Wyatt said, and there was something in his tone Clayton couldn't quite place. "Built yourself quite an empire here." "Not an empire, just a working ranch." Clayton swung down from his horse to examine a calf that seemed to be limping. The animal shied away, but he moved slowly, talking soft, and managed to check the leg. Nothing broken, just a stone bruise that would heal on its own. "Takes work to keep it going. Can't ever rest on what you've built. Got to maintain it, tend it, or it all falls apart." "Some men might say you've done enough work for one lifetime," Wyatt said. "Might say you've earned a chance to rest." Clayton straightened, looking up at the younger man. "I'll rest when I'm dead. Until then, I've got responsibilities. He swung back into his saddle. "Speaking of which, I need you to ride into town this afternoon. Pick up that order from the feed store and stop by the bank. I'm expecting a payment from the cattle buyer in Cheyenne." "Sure thing." Wyatt's smile was easy, familiar, but as Clayton watched him ride off toward the northern fence line, something nagged at the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't name, a sense that the world he'd built so carefully was somehow shifting beneath him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was getting older, that was all. Getting cautious and suspicious the way old men sometimes did. Wyatt and the others were good men who'd made mistakes in their past, but were building better futures. He'd helped them do that. It was something to be proud of. That evening, after the day's work was done, Clayton sat in his office going over the ranch accounts. The numbers didn't quite add up, and hadn't for several months now. Expenses seemed higher than they should be. Feed costs, equipment repairs, wages, all of it adding up to more than what the receipts showed. He made a note to check the ledgers more carefully, to match every entry against the actual invoices and receipts he kept filed in the cabinet. The silver pocket watch sat on the desk beside the open account book, its face catching the lamplight. He picked it up, opened it, checked the time, even though he'd done so a dozen times already that day. 9:15. The house was quiet around him. Too quiet the way it had been since Margaret passed. In the old days, she'd be in the kitchen at this hour, putting together tomorrow's bread dough or mending something by lamplight. They'd talk about the day's work, about Sarah's letters, about plans for the future. Now he was alone with numbers that didn't balance and a feeling in his gut that something was wrong. He closed the watch, held it in his palm, feeling the weight of it. 3 generations of Bairds had carried this watch. It had survived the journey west, survived drought and hard winters, and all the challenges that came with carving a life from raw land. It was a reminder that he came from strong people, people who endured. Whatever was happening with the accounts, he'd figure it out. He always did. Tomorrow he'd sit down with Wyatt and go through everything, get it all straightened out. There was probably a simple explanation. Receipts filed in the wrong place, calculations done hastily and incorrectly. Nothing sinister, nothing that couldn't be fixed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window glass. Storm coming, maybe. He could smell it in the air, that particular scent of rain approaching across dry land. The cattle would need checking before it hit. The horses secured, all the normal preparations for normal weather. Clayton stood, stretched, felt his back protest. 58 wasn't old, not really. But he wasn't young either. The work was getting harder, the days longer. Maybe Wyatt was right. Maybe he had earned some rest. Maybe it was time to think about stepping back, letting younger men take on more responsibility. Sarah wasn't interested in ranching, but perhaps he could make Wyatt a partner, give him a stake in the land's future. The boy had been loyal all these years. That should count for something. He tucked the watch back into his vest pocket, where it belonged, close to his heart. Whatever tomorrow brought, he'd face it the way he'd faced everything, with honesty, with strength, and with the values his father had taught him. The storm was coming. He could hear thunder now, distant but growing closer. Rain would be good for the grass. Everything in its season, everything in its time. That was the rhythm of life out here, the pattern he'd learned to trust. He had no way of knowing that this storm would bring more than rain, that it would wash away everything he'd built, everything he believed in, everything he thought he knew about trust and loyalty and the nature of men. He had no way of knowing that by tomorrow the silver pocket watch would be in someone else's pocket, and he'd be alone in the wilderness with nothing left but his life and the hard lessons that come from surviving betrayal. The storm broke just after midnight, rain hammering the ranch house roof like 1,000 angry fists. Clayton woke to thunder that shook the windows and lightning that turned the darkness into brief, stark daylight. He lay there for a moment, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, then rose and dressed. Storms like this could spook the cattle, and there was always the chance of lightning strikes starting fires, despite the rain. He pulled on his boots, buckled his gun belt, the Colt revolver his father had carried. engraved along the barrel with words his grandfather had chosen: "Justice through mercy." It was a family heirloom as much as the pocket watch, and Clayton wore it, not because he expected trouble, but because it was part of who he was, part of the legacy he carried. The house was dark as he made his way downstairs. Through the windows, he could see the bunkhouse lit up, figures moving inside. Good. The hands were awake too, probably getting ready to check the herds. He grabbed his slicker from the hook by the door and stepped out into the deluge. Rain hit him like a physical force, cold and relentless. He lowered his head and made his way toward the bunkhouse, boots squelching in mud that was already ankle-deep. The wind tried to tear his hat off, and he held it down with one hand while he walked. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ranch yard in electric white. And in that brief moment, he saw all four of his hands standing on the bunkhouse porch, watching him approach. Something in their posture made him slow. They weren't preparing for work. They were waiting. For him, he climbed the 3 steps to the porch, rain streaming from his slicker. "Storm's a bad one. We should talk, Clayton." Wyatt's voice cut through the sound of rain. He stood in the center of the group, thumbs hooked in his belt, his face shadowed beneath his hat brim. "Been meaning to have a conversation with you." Clayton pushed back his own hat, water running down his face. "Middle of a storm seems an odd time for talking. Can't it wait until morning?" "No," Wyatt said simply. "It can't." The other 3, Dutch, Tommy, and Ray, said nothing. They stood behind Wyatt like a wall, their faces unreadable in the darkness between lightning strikes. Something was wrong. Every instinct Clayton had developed over nearly 60 years of living was screaming at him now. "All right, then. Let's step inside where it's dry." He moved toward the bunkhouse door, but Wyatt shifted to block his path. "Here's fine. What we have to say won't take long." Clayton's hand moved unconsciously toward his revolver, not drawing it, just resting there. "You're making me nervous, Wyatt. That's not like you. You know what's not like you, Clayton?" Wyatt's voice had an edge to it now, sharp and bitter. "Noticing things, paying attention. You've been so busy being the benevolent cattle baron, so caught up in your own righteousness, that you missed what was happening right under your nose. If you've got something to say it plain. The cattle we've been selling off books for the past 6 months. The money we've been skimming from your accounts. The deals we've made with buyers in Kansas and Nebraska, using your name and reputation, but keeping the profits." Wyatt smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "That plain enough for you?" Clayton felt something crack inside his chest, a physical sensation like ice breaking. "You've been stealing from me." "Stealing?" Wyatt laughed, a harsh sound nearly lost in the storm. "That's rich coming from a man who stole everything he has. I never stole a thing in my life." "No? You just had it handed to you. Land from your father who got it from his father, born into wealth and privilege, and you strut around like you earned it through some kind of moral superiority." Wyatt took a step closer. "Men like me, we had nothing. No inheritance, no family ranch, no silver spoon. We had to scrape for every scrap, and even then, men like you looked down on us. I never looked down on you. I gave you a chance, gave you all chances. You gave us scraps." Wyatt's shout cut through the thunder. "Wages like we should be grateful. A roof over our heads like we were dogs you took pity on. You want to know what you really gave us, Clayton? You gave us a front row seat to watch you live in comfort while we broke our backs making you richer. That's not," Clayton started. But Dutch moved forward, his face twisted with emotions Clayton couldn't read in the flickering darkness. "He's right," Dutch said quietly. "Maybe not about all of it, but about some. You're a good man, Clayton. But you never saw us as equals. We were always your charity cases, your redemption projects. The kind souls you could point to and say, 'Look what I did for these poor unfortunates.'" The words hit harder than fists. "That's not true. That's not how I saw any of you." "It doesn't matter how you saw us," Wyatt said. "What matters is what we decided. We're taking the ranch. We've already got the paperwork drawn up, forged your signature on a bill of sale, made it look like you sold us the property. We've got witnesses lined up in town who'll swear you've been acting strange since Margaret died, talking about ending it all, getting your affairs in order." Clayton's hand closed on his revolver grip. "You won't get away with this. We already have." Wyatt nodded to Ray and Tommy, and they moved before Clayton could react. Ray grabbed his gun arm, and Tommy caught the other, and together they slammed him back against the bunkhouse wall. Pain exploded through Clayton's shoulders and head. "Take his gun," Wyatt ordered. Dutch hesitated, his face pale even in the darkness. But he stepped forward and unbuckled Clayton's gun belt, pulled it free. The Colt revolver, his father's gun, his family's legacy, disappeared into Dutch's hands. "The watch, too," Wyatt said. "That pretty silver pocket watch you're always checking. Must be worth something." "No." Clayton tried to fight as Tommy reached into his vest, but Ray twisted his arm behind his back, sending fresh agony through his shoulder. The watch came free, chain and all, and Tommy held it up like a trophy. "3 generations," Clayton gasped. "That watch has been in my family, was in your family," Wyatt corrected. "Now it's mine, along with everything else." He came close, so close Clayton could see the rain dripping from his hat brim, could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You know what the worst part is, Clayton? You still don't understand. You think this is about money, about the ranch. It's not. It's about you finally getting what you deserve. It's about putting you where you should have been all along, outside in the cold with nothing. I gave you everything. You gave us nothing that mattered." Wyatt's voice was cold as the rain. "And now we're taking it back." They beat him then. Not quickly, not mercifully, but with methodical cruelty. Fists to his face, his ribs, his stomach. He tried to fight back, but he was 1 man against 4. And they were younger, stronger, fueled by rage and greed and whatever twisted justifications they'd built in their minds. He felt his lips split, tasted blood, felt ribs crack, felt his left eye swelling shut. Through it all, he could hear Wyatt's voice, a litany of grievances, real and imagined. "This is for every time you made me feel small. This is for every condescending pat on the shoulder. This is for being born lucky, while the rest of us had to fight for scraps." When they finally stopped, Clayton was on his knees in the mud, barely conscious, the rain mixing with blood on his face. Wyatt crouched down beside him, grabbed his hair, pulled his head back. "Listen close, old man. We're going to drag you off this property, throw you out into the wilderness. You're going to die out there alone and forgotten, and nobody's going to care. The story will be that you went mad with grief, wandered off into the hills. They'll search for a few days, find nothing, and life will go on. We'll run this ranch, spend your money, and sleep in your bed. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it." They hauled him up, half carried and half dragged him through the ranch yard. Past the house he'd grown up in, past the barn his father built, past everything he'd worked for, everything he'd believed in. The rain kept falling, washing the blood from his face, only to have it replaced by more. At the property line, they threw him down. He landed hard, face first in the mud, and for a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the pain that radiated from every part of his body. Behind him, he heard their laughter. Heard Wyatt say, "Good riddance to the benevolent saint of Dry Hollow." Then they were gone, their voices fading back toward the ranch house, his ranch house, leaving him alone in the storm. Clayton lay there for a long time, the rain hammering down on him, washing away blood and tears and everything he'd thought he understood about human nature. His ribs screamed with every breath. His face felt like shattered pottery. His shoulder might have been dislocated. But worse than all the physical pain was the emptiness inside him, the hollow space where trust and faith had once lived. He'd built his life on certain principles. He'd believed that if you treated people fairly, they'd return that fairness. That if you gave people chances, they'd rise to meet them. That loyalty earned was loyalty kept. He'd been wrong about all of it. Eventually, survival instinct forced him to move. He couldn't stay here. If he did, he'd die of exposure before morning. He had to find shelter, had to get out of this rain. He pushed himself up to his hands and knees, gasping at the pain, then managed to stagger to his feet. The wilderness stretched before him, dark and endless. Behind him, the ranch lights glowed warm and mocking. They'd taken everything. His land, his legacy, his family's heritage. The watch his grandfather carried west. The revolver with its inscription about justice and mercy, even the dignity of his own name. but they'd left him one thing they couldn't take, his life. For whatever that was worth now, Clayton turned his back on Dry Hollow and stumbled into the darkness, the rain his only companion, the thunder drowning out the sound of everything he'd lost, breaking behind him. The first week was a blur of pain and survival. Clayton found shelter in a shallow cave halfway up the mesa, barely more than an overhang of rock that kept the worst of the rain off. He'd lost track of how long he'd been walking when he found it. Hours, maybe a full day. His body had moved on pure instinct, while his mind circled endlessly around the betrayal. Unable to process or understand it, he lay in that cave for days, shivering despite the relative warmth, his injuries making every breath an agony. The rain finally stopped, replaced by cold spring wind that cut through his wet clothes. He should have died there. Part of him wanted to. What was the point of surviving when everything that defined him was gone? But survival has its own momentum. When the pain receded enough for hunger to break through, he forced himself to move. There was a stream nearby. He'd heard it before he found the cave. He crawled to it on hands and knees, drank until his stomach cramped, then collapsed on the bank. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache, but it was clean and it kept him alive. Food was harder. He had no gun, no knife, no tools of any kind. For the first few days, he survived on wild onions he found near the stream and the inner bark of cottonwood trees, bitter and stringy but edible. His stomach rebelled against it, but he kept it down through sheer will. He was a rancher, had been all his life, but before that, his father had taught him the old ways of survival. Knowledge he'd never expected to need came back slowly. Which plants were safe, how to find water, how to read the land. The real blessing came on the 6th day, when he found a deer carcass near the stream, recently killed but barely touched. Something had brought it down and then abandoned it. Unusual behavior for a predator. Clayton didn't question the gift. He used a sharp rock to hack away chunks of meat, eating some raw because he had no way to make fire, catching the rest in the cold stream to keep it from spoiling too quickly. It was while he was working on the carcass that he first saw them. Wolves, a pack of them, perhaps a dozen strong, watching from the tree line 50 yards away. They'd been drawn by the smell of blood, and now they stood in a loose semicircle, golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The alpha was unmistakable. A massive grey wolf, easily 130 pounds, with a distinctive scar running from his left eye down across his muzzle. An old wound, long healed, but one that gave the animal a fierce, almost knowing expression. The wolf stood at the center of the pack, utterly still, utterly focused. Clayton's first instinct was to run, but he was too weak, too injured. And some part of him understood that running would trigger their chase instinct. Instead, he straightened slowly, facing them, one hand still gripping the rock he'd been using as a tool. He was prey here, wounded prey, but he'd be damned if he'd act like it. "This is mine," he said aloud, his voice rasping from days of disuse. "I need it, but there's enough to share if that's your way." The alpha's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. The other wolves shifted, uneasy, looking to their leader for guidance. Clayton could see the calculation in those intelligent eyes. Was this injured human worth the fight? Was the meat worth the risk? Time stretched. Clayton didn't move, didn't blink, kept his gaze level with the alphas. It was a confrontation as real as any he'd had with men, and the stakes were just as high. His life measured in the space between heartbeats. Finally, the alpha took a step back. One step, then another. The rest of the pack followed his lead, melting back into the trees with barely a sound. Only the scarred wolf remained for a moment longer, and Clayton could have sworn he saw something like respect in that golden gaze before the animal turned and vanished into the forest. Clayton's legs gave out. He sat down hard beside the deer carcass, his hands shaking, adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. He'd just stared down a wolf pack and lived. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the sound that came out was more like a sob. That night, as he huddled in his cave with strips of venison laid out on the rocks to dry in the wind, he heard them howling. The sound echoed off the mesa walls, mournful and wild, a song older than human presence in these hills. He'd heard wolves before, distant sounds in the night that ranchers spoke of with caution and sometimes fear. But this was different. This was hearing them as another creature of the wilderness, not as a man with walls and weapons between himself and the wild. The howling didn't frighten him. It was strangely comforting, a reminder that life continued in all its raw forms, that survival was the oldest law and the truest. Men might betray, might lie, might twist honor into weapons. But a wolf was simply a wolf, honest in its nature. Over the following days he saw them again, always at a distance, always watching. The pack was hunting in the area. He found evidence of their kills, and twice he came upon them feeding. Each time they would withdraw, giving him space but never disappearing entirely. It was as if they'd accepted his presence in their territory. Neither threat nor packmate, but something in between. The alpha was always there, distinctive with his scarred face, watching Clayton with what seemed like curiosity. Clayton began to understand the pack's hierarchy through observation. The alpha led, but there was a beta wolf who enforced his decisions. There were younger wolves, playful and eager. There were older wolves, careful and wise. Each had their place, each understood their role. It was loyalty and structure, built on something more primal than words or promises, built on survival itself. His injuries healed slowly. The ribs knitted back together, painful but functional. The swelling in his face went down, though he caught sight of himself in the stream's reflection and barely recognized the gaunt, bearded stranger staring back. The dislocated shoulder took longest, weeks of careful movement and gradual strengthening before he could use the arm without agony shooting through it. He learned to move quietly through the forest, to recognize the signs of game trails and water sources. He learned which roots and berries were edible in spring, how to catch fish with his bare hands in the shallow parts of the stream, how to construct basic shelters and improve his cave with walls of stacked stones and dried grass. He was becoming something he'd never been before, not a rancher, not a civilized man with property and position, but simply a man learning to exist in the world without the structures of society to support him. The wolves taught him, though they never came close. He watched how they hunted, working together to drive elk and deer toward ambush points. He watched how they communicated, the body language and subtle sounds that passed between them. He watched how the alpha maintained order not through cruelty but through confidence, through the understanding that the pack's survival depended on each member knowing their place and trusting the others. One evening, as spring edged toward summer and the days grew longer, Clayton sat outside his cave, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Below, in the valley, he could see smoke rising from what had been his ranch. They were still there, the men who'd taken everything from him, living his life, walking his land, sleeping under his roof. He should have felt rage, should have been planning revenge, plotting how to take back what was stolen. But sitting there in the wilderness, his belly full of rabbit meat he'd managed to trap, his body lean and harder than it had been in years, he felt something else. Not peace exactly, but a kind of clarity. Men had betrayed him. That was truth. But what did that mean about the life he'd lived? Had he really been as blind as Wyatt claimed? Had his kindness been a form of condescension? The questions circled in his mind like the wolves circled their hunting grounds, never quite resolving into answers. Below in the valley a howl rose up, and Clayton found himself responding before he thought about it, a rough approximation that made his throat ache. The sound surprised him, but it felt right somehow. Natural. He was no longer the man he'd been. That Clayton Baird was gone, left bleeding in the rain outside his own ranch. This Clayton, scarred, lean, harder, was something new. Something being born in the wilderness among creatures who understood loyalty not as a choice, but as survival itself. And somewhere in that transformation, a truth began to take shape. He would return to Dry Hollow, not for revenge, not to reclaim property or demand justice in human courts, but for something simpler and more essential. He would return for respect. He would make them see what they'd tried to destroy, what they'd failed to understand about the man they'd betrayed. He would return. But first, he had more to learn. Summer arrived with heat that baked the high mesa and turned the valley grass golden. Clayton had been in the wilderness for 3 months, and the man who'd stumbled into these hills, broken and bleeding, was almost unrecognizable. His hair had grown long and gray, pulled back with a strip of bark fiber. His beard was thick and shot through with silver. His hands, once soft from years of managing rather than doing the hardest ranch work, were now calloused and strong. His body had shed excess weight, leaving muscle and sinew visible beneath tanned skin. He'd carved himself a walking staff from mountain ash, spending patient evenings working the wood with a sharp stone, smoothing it, strengthening it. The staff served multiple purposes: a support when climbing the steep trails, a tool for testing ground, and, if needed, a weapon. He'd notched marks into it to track the passing days, a tally that reminded him he was still human, still capable of measuring time, even when time seemed to have lost its meaning. The wolves had become a constant presence. Not companions exactly, but something close to neighbors who'd accepted his right to share their territory. He'd given them names in his mind, though he never spoke them aloud. The scarred alpha was Ghost, for the way he could appear and disappear like smoke. The beta was Smoke, a darker grey wolf who enforced the alpha's will. There was Runner, a young male full of energy and curiosity. There was Mother, an older female with patient eyes who often kept watch over the pack's pups. They'd learned to coexist in ways that surprised him. Sometimes he'd find meat left near his cave, scraps from their hunts that they didn't need. He returned the favor when he could, leaving portions of his own catches in places they frequented. It wasn't friendship, but it was something, an understanding, a mutual recognition that survival was easier when you weren't completely alone. One afternoon in mid-July, Clayton was checking a snare he'd set near the stream when he heard voices. Human voices, the first he'd encountered since that terrible night. He froze, every instinct screaming caution, and slowly made his way toward the sound, moving as quietly as the wolves had taught him. 2 trappers, weathered men in their 40s, were watering their horses near the stream. They spoke casually, unaware of his presence in the tree line 30 yards away. "Hear about that ranch near Dry Hollow?" one was saying. "The Baird place?" Clayton's hand tightened on his walking staff. "The one where the owner went crazy?" The other responded. "Heard something about that." "What about it?" "New owners are running it into the ground, from what folks say. 4 young fellows, supposed to be ranch hands, Baird trained up. They claim he went mad after his wife died, gave them the property, then wandered off into the hills to die. Convenient story. That's what some think. Sheriff Hoskins has his doubts, I heard. But without a body or any proof of foul play, what can he do? And these fellows have papers that look legal enough. Shame. I met Clayton Baird once, years back. Seemed like a decent man. World's full of decent men who get taken advantage of. The trapper spat into the stream. But these new owners, they're letting the place fall apart. Drinking away the profits, folks say. Gambling, living high while the ranch work goes undone. Give it another year or 2. That place will be worthless. They mounted up and rode off, their voices fading into the afternoon heat. Clayton stayed hidden until long after they'd gone, his mind churning with the information. So that was the story. He'd gone mad, given away his ranch, wandered off. And the wolves, not knowing about forged documents and legal claims, were running his life's work into ruin through incompetence and greed. Part of him felt a bitter satisfaction. They get what they deserved in the end, poverty and failure. But a larger part felt grief for what was being destroyed. The land his grandfather had claimed, the herds his father had built. The legacy 3 generations of Bairds had created, all of it being wasted by men who valued only what they could take, never what they could build. That night, he sat outside his cave, watching the stars wheel overhead, the walking staff across his knees. His daughter Sarah was somewhere out there in Denver, probably believing the same story everyone else did. probably grieving for a father she thought had lost his mind to sorrow. He should send word somehow, let her know he was alive. But what could he tell her? That he'd been beaten and robbed by men he'd trusted? That he was living like a wild man in the hills? That he'd been too weak to fight back, too foolish to see the betrayal coming? The shame of it burned worse than his injuries ever had. Not the survival. He'd learned there was no shame in adapting to circumstances, but the blindness that had led him here, the naive trust that had made him vulnerable. Wyatt had been right about one thing. Clayton had been so convinced of his own righteousness, so certain that his way of living was the right way, that he'd never considered the resentment building in men he'd thought of as sons. A howl rose from somewhere down the slope, ghost calling to the pack. Clayton listened as others answered, a chorus of voices in the darkness. The wolves were gathering for a hunt. He'd watched them do this dozens of times now, understood the patterns of their coordination. They would fan out, drive prey toward the strongest hunters, and bring down animals 10 times their individual size through cooperation. That was the key, he realized. Not strength alone, but working together with a shared purpose. The pack survived because each wolf trusted the others to fulfill their role. They didn't need promises or contracts. They had something deeper, the understanding that betraying the pack meant death for everyone, including the betrayer. Human society tried to build that same kind of loyalty through words and laws and moral codes. But words could be twisted, laws could be circumvented, and moral codes meant nothing to men who'd convinced themselves that their grievances justified any action. The pack's way was more honest, more primal, and in some ways more just. Clayton stood, gripping his walking staff, and looked down at the valley where his ranch lay. The lights were visible even from this height, warm against the darkness. His property, his life, inhabited by strangers. The injustice of it still stung, but the raw rage had burned itself out during these months of survival. What remained was something colder, more focused. He would return. Not tomorrow, not next week, but when he was ready, when he'd learned everything the wilderness had to teach him, when he was no longer the soft, trusting fool who'd been so easily betrayed. The man who'd returned to Dry Hollow would be something new, something forged in hardship and survival. Tempered by the lessons of wolves and wild places, he began walking, following the sounds of the pack as they hunted. They'd grown accustomed enough to his presence that they no longer fled when he appeared. Runner, the young male, sometimes came close enough that Clayton could see the curiosity in his eyes, though the wolf always kept a safe distance. Mother watched him with what seemed like approval when he moved quietly, disapproval when he crashed through undergrowth like a human unused to wild spaces. The hunt took them down the mesa into a valley thick with pine. Clayton found a position on high ground where he could observe without interfering. The pack had spotted an elk, a large bull that had wandered from its herd. Ghost positioned his wolves with precision, some to flush the prey, others waiting in ambush along the likely escape routes. Clayton watched as they executed their plan with a coordination that would have impressed any military commander. The elk never had a chance. It was over quickly, almost mercifully, and then the pack fed according to hierarchy. Ghost and Smoke eating first, the others waiting their turn. Later, as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Clayton made his way back to his cave. He was tired, but it was the good tiredness of physical exertion, not the soul-deep exhaustion that had plagued him in those first terrible weeks. He felt alive in ways he hadn't in years, maybe decades. The ranch work had kept him busy, but it had been routine, comfortable, predictable. This was different. Every day required full engagement, full awareness. There was no room for distraction or emotional wallowing. You survived or you didn't, and the choice was made moment by moment through 1,000 small decisions. He carved another notch into his walking staff. 106 days since the betrayal. 106 days of learning to be something other than what he'd been. The staff had become an extension of himself, smoothed by constant handling, strengthened by the work of shaping it. It was a tool, a weapon, a companion. And it was his, made by his own hands, not inherited or given, but created through his own effort. That meant something. He was no longer living off his grandfather's land or his father's legacy. He was surviving through his own skill, his own determination. Everything he had, the cave shelter, the dried meat hanging from rocks, the rough clothing he'd made from deer hide, the snares and traps he'd built, all of it came from his own work. And that gave him a kind of pride, different from what he'd felt running the ranch. This was earned. This was real. This was his. And when he returned to Dry Hollow, he would carry that reality with him. Not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a man who'd been broken and remade, who'd learned that respect wasn't given by inheritance or position, but earned through the simple fact of surviving when survival seemed impossible. The wolves had taught him that. The wilderness had taught him that. And soon, very soon, he would teach it to the men who'd thought they could destroy him. He lay down in his cave, the walking staff within reach, and listened to the morning birds beginning their songs. Summer would turn to autumn, autumn to winter. He would survive those seasons too, would learn what each had to teach. And when spring came again, when the storms returned like the storm that had witnessed his betrayal, he would descend from these hills. Not alone. Never alone again. The pack would come with him. And Dry Hollow would learn what it meant to push a decent man too far. Spring arrived in Dry Hollow, with torrential rains that turned the roads to mud and the valley into a patchwork of standing water. Wyatt Crenshaw stood on the porch of the ranch house, his ranch house now, watching the storm with a whiskey glass in hand, and an unease in his gut that no amount of drinking could wash away. 18 months had passed since they'd thrown the old man out. Into a storm like this one. 18 months of living in Clayton Baird's house, sleeping in his bed, spending his money. Should have felt like victory. Should have felt like justice after all those years of taking orders and smiling while being treated like charity. Instead, it felt like waiting for an axe to fall. "You're doing it again," Dutch said from behind him. He sat at the kitchen table, a deck of cards spread before him in a solitaire game he'd been playing for the past hour without once finishing. "Staring out at nothing like you're expecting the old man to come walking out of the rain." "He's dead," Wyatt said flatly. "Been dead over a year. No one survives that long in the wilderness, especially not at his age, especially not with the injuries we gave him." "Then why do you keep watching?" Wyatt didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know. Logic said Dutch was right. Clayton Baird was dead. His body probably scattered by animals, his bones bleaching somewhere in the high hills. But logic didn't explain the dreams Wyatt had been having. Dreams where the old man stood outside the window with eyes that held judgment and something worse than anger. It didn't explain the way his hand sometimes went to his gun when he heard unexpected sounds at night. "This place is falling apart," Tommy Vickers said, coming in from the rain with water streaming from his hat. "North fence is down again, and I don't know how many head we lost in last week's storm. Could be a dozen, could be 50. Nobody's bothered to count. We'll count them later," Wyatt said, though they both knew later meant never. "That's what you said last month." And the month before that, Tommy pulled off his wet coat with sharp, angry movements. "You know what the problem is? None of us actually know how to run a ranch. We know how to follow orders, how to do the work when someone tells us what needs doing. But managing all of it, we're drowning in it, Wyatt. Then learn." "That's what Clayton did. Clayton was born to this," Dutch said quietly, still not looking up from his cards. "He had his father teaching him, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of knowledge. We've got 18 months of pretending and a lot of unpaid bills." The bills were piling up on Clayton's desk. Wyatt's desk now, though he could never quite think of it that way. Feed suppliers, equipment repairs, taxes on the land. Money flowed out faster than it came in, especially with Ray's gambling and their collective drinking. The ranch that had been profitable under Clayton's careful management was bleeding funds under theirs. Wyatt remembered the hand-tooled saddle Clayton had given him for his 21st birthday. Custom-made, expensive, with his initials carved into the leather. At the time, he'd been genuinely touched. thought it meant the old man saw him as worthy, as special. Later he'd convinced himself it was condescension. Look at the pretty toy I bought for my pet. But standing here now, watching the rain destroy fences they couldn't afford to repair, he wondered if maybe it had just been kindness. Simple, uncomplicated kindness from a man who wanted to celebrate someone he cared about. The thought made him angry, and he pushed it away. Clayton Baird had gotten what he deserved. End of story. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Ray Sutton answered it, and a moment later Sheriff Hoskins stepped inside, his badge catching the lamplight, his face grave beneath the brim of his wet hat. "Wyatt," he said with a nod. "Boys, mind if I come in and dry off?" "It's your town, Sheriff," Wyatt said, gesturing to a chair. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Got a visitor in town I think you'll want to know about." Hoskins settled into the chair, his hand resting on his gun belt in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't quite casual either. "Clayton's daughter, Sarah. She arrived yesterday on the stage from Denver." The whiskey glass stopped halfway to Wyatt's mouth. "What's she want?" "Same thing she wanted when she was here 8 months ago. Answers about what happened to her father. She doesn't believe the story about him going mad. Her disbelief doesn't change facts," Wyatt said carefully. "Clayton lost his mind with grief after his wife died. We all saw it happening. He signed the ranch over to us, said he was going to head west, try to find peace. Instead, he wandered off into the hills. We searched for days." "I remember your story," Hoskins interrupted. "Heard it enough times. Thing is, Sarah's a schoolteacher. Smart woman. She's been asking questions, looking through county records, talking to folks who knew her father, and she's found some inconsistencies." "Like what?" Dutch asked, his voice tight. "Like the timing on your bill of sale. Like the fact that nobody actually saw Clayton sign it. Like the way you all suddenly had money to spend right after he supposedly left." The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Like the fact that Clayton Baird was one of the most level-headed men I've ever known. And the idea that he'd go mad and give away everything his family built doesn't sit right with anyone who actually knew him. Grief does strange things to people." Wyatt said, "So does greed." Hoskins stood. "I'm watching you boys. I always have been. And if Sarah finds proof of wrongdoing, if she finds anything that suggests you harmed Clayton or forced him off his land, I'll see you hang. That clear enough?" "Crystal," Wyatt said, keeping his voice level despite the fury building in his chest. After the sheriff left, silence filled the room. Finally Ray spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we should leave. Take what money's left and head to California or somewhere. If she's digging into things, if people are asking questions—" "We're not running," Wyatt snapped. "This is our ranch. We earned it by putting up with years of Clayton's patronizing charity. We're not giving it up because his daughter has doubts. But if she finds something, she won't. There's nothing to find. The old man is dead and buried somewhere in those hills, and all the suspicion in the world won't change that." Dutch had gone pale, his cards forgotten. "I can't sleep," he said quietly. "Haven't slept properly in months. I see him every time I close my eyes, see him lying there in the rain, bleeding. What we did was take back what should have been ours from the start," Wyatt said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You want to confess to the sheriff, Dutch? You want to spend the next 20 years in prison or swing from a rope? Because that's what'll happen if you talk. Maybe that's what we deserve. Shut your mouth." Wyatt crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Dutch by the shirt. "You don't get to have a conscience now. You were there. You helped. Your hands are as bloody as mine." "More," Dutch whispered. "I took his gun, took his watch. I looked him in the eye while we beat him." His voice broke. "He trusted us. He tried to help us, and we destroyed him for it." Wyatt released him with a shove, turned away. The truth was he felt it too, the weight of what they'd done, growing heavier as the months passed. The ranch wasn't a victory. It was a prison, and they were all trapped in it, haunted by a ghost they'd created themselves. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof like accusing fingers. Lightning flashed, illuminating the valley in stark white. And for just a moment, Wyatt could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the property line, watching the house. But when the darkness returned, there was nothing there. Just his imagination, just guilt manifesting as shadows. Clayton Baird was dead. Had to be dead. No one survived 18 months in the wilderness. Still, Wyatt found himself checking the window again, and the whiskey in his glass trembled just slightly, catching the lamplight like tears or accusations he couldn't quite name. In town, Sarah Baird sat in her room at the boarding house, her mother's letters spread across the bed. She was reading them again, searching for clues, for anything that might explain what had really happened to her father. The grief had been terrible when she'd first heard the news, but it had transformed over the months into something else, a certainty that the story didn't fit the man she knew. Her father had been distant after her mother died, yes, emotionally closed off in ways that hurt, but mad, careless with his legacy. Those weren't the traits of Clayton Baird. He'd been methodical, careful, a man who planned for generations. Something had happened, something the Outlaws weren't telling. And she would find out what, even if it took years. Her father deserved that much. The truth deserved that much. Outside her window, the storm raged on, washing the streets clean, carrying away old lies in rivers of muddy water. And somewhere in the hills beyond town, in caves and canyons where civilization hadn't yet reached, a man who'd been left for dead was learning the final lessons he'd need before returning to claim what was stolen. The wolves howled in the distance, their voices carrying on the wind, a promise and a warning that spring had arrived, and with it, the season of reckoning. Sarah Baird had inherited her mother's determination and her father's patience, a combination that made her particularly effective when she decided something needed investigating. She'd been in Dry Hollow for 3 days now, and every hour brought new certainties that her father hadn't simply wandered off to die. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Helen Garrett, a widow in her 60s who'd known Clayton for 30 years. On Sarah's second evening there, Helen brought tea to her room and sat down with the practiced ease of someone about to share important information. "Your father used to come by every month," Helen said, stirring honey into her cup. "Always brought me fresh beef from the ranch, wouldn't take payment for it. Said he remembered how hard things were when my husband passed, and he wanted to make sure I was eating proper." "That sounds like him," Sarah said softly. "The morning after that storm, the night they say he left, I saw Wyatt Crenshaw in town. He was selling your father's pocket watch to the jeweler. That beautiful silver piece that had been in your family for generations. Mr. Peterson, the jeweler, he told me later that Wyatt claimed Clayton gave it to him as payment for services. But your father paid fair wages, always had. Why would he suddenly need to give away family heirlooms?" Sarah's hands tightened on her teacup. "Do you know where the watch is now?" "Wyatt bought it back a week later. Guess he realized it might look suspicious. But Mr. Peterson remembers. Quite a few folks remember things that don't quite add up with the official story." Over the next 2 days, Sarah collected more pieces. The general store owner mentioned unusual quantities of whiskey being purchased on the ranch account after Clayton supposedly left. The feed supplier noted that orders had become irregular and often went unpaid, something that had never happened in 30 years of doing business with Clayton Baird. Ranch hands, who'd worked for her father, but left when the new owners took over, spoke carefully, clearly afraid, but hinted at violence and threats. The pattern was clear to anyone who wanted to see it. Something terrible had happened that stormy night, and 4 men were lying about it. On the 4th day, Sheriff Hoskins invited her to his office. He was a weathered man in his early 60s, with eyes that had seen too much human ugliness but still maintained a kind of weary hope in justice. "I can't prove anything," he said bluntly after she'd shared her findings. "Suspicion isn't evidence. Questions aren't proof. Without a body, without witnesses, without any physical evidence of foul play, my hands are tied. You believe something happened to him. I know something happened to him." Hoskins pulled out a folder, spread papers across his desk. "Your father was a careful man. He kept detailed records, filed copies of important documents with my office for safekeeping. Standard practice for property owners. But the bill of sale those boys claim proves their ownership. It's not in those files. And the signature looks wrong to me, though I'm no expert in forgery. Can we get an expert? With what money? On what grounds? They're running that ranch now, and until someone can prove they shouldn't be, the law protects their claim. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. I'm telling you this so you understand what you're up against. These aren't good men, Sarah. They're desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. If you keep pushing, if you get too close to something they want hidden, they might do to you what I suspect they did to your father. The threat should have frightened her. Instead, it made her angry. He raised those men, fed them, taught them, treated them like family, and they repaid him with betrayal and possibly murder. I'm not walking away from that. I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you to be smart about it, careful. Let me help you when I can, but don't confront them directly. Don't put yourself at risk. That afternoon, Sarah did exactly what the sheriff had warned against. She rode out to the ranch, her mother's old horse saddled from the livery stable, her determination outweighing her caution. The place looked different from her memories. Fences sagged. Buildings needed paint. Weeds grew thick in the yard. Her father had always kept everything immaculate, had taken pride in the appearance of the property. This looked like neglect, like men who'd won something they didn't know how to keep. Wyatt met her at the house, his hand resting on his gun belt in a way that made his threat clear. Miss Baird, didn't expect to see you out here. It's still my family's property, she said, keeping her voice level. I have a right to see it. It's not your family's property anymore. Your father signed it over to us, legal and proper. You want to see the papers? I've seen the papers. I've also talked to people in town, asked questions, found interesting answers. Something flickered in Wyatt's eyes. Fear, anger, whatever you think you found, you're wrong. Your father's grief made him unpredictable. He gave us this ranch and left. That's the truth of it. My father was many things, but unpredictable wasn't one of them. Sarah dismounted, tied her horse. I'd like to look through the house. There are some of my mother's things I'd like to have, if you haven't sold them yet. She could see him calculating, weighing the risk of refusing against the risk of allowing. Finally, he stepped aside. Fine, but I'm watching you. Don't take anything that isn't clearly personal items. The house felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. It smelled of whiskey and unwashed men, of neglect and decay. Her mother's careful touches, the curtains she'd sewn, the furniture she'd arranged, were still there but buried under dirt and disorder. Dishes piled in the sink. Muddy boots on the clean floors. Margaret had always insisted be swept daily. Sarah climbed the stairs to what had been her parents' bedroom, Wyatt following close behind. The room had been ransacked, her mother's clothes scattered, drawers left open. And there, carelessly tossed on top of a pile of her mother's jewelry, was the wedding ring, her mother's wedding ring, simple gold with a small diamond, the one she'd worn every day of her married life and been buried wearing, or should have been buried wearing. Sarah's hands shook as she picked it up. Why do you have my mother's wedding ring? Wyatt's face paled. Your father must have kept it. Didn't want to bury it with her. My father buried her with that ring. I was there. I saw him place it on her finger in the casket. I watched them close the lid. She turned to face him, and her voice was ice. You dug up my mother's grave. You robbed her body. What kind of men are you? We didn't. I don't know where that came from. You're a liar. She closed her fist around the ring. You're a liar and a thief, and I'm going to prove it. I'm going to find out what you did to my father, and I'm going to see you pay for it. She pushed past him, down the stairs, her heart hammering. Behind her she heard Dutch Mallory's voice, quiet but carrying. She knows, Wyatt, it's over. We should confess, try for mercy. Shut up, Wyatt hissed. Just shut up. Sarah made it to her horse, mounted quickly. As she rode away, she looked back once and saw all four of them standing on the porch, watching her go. Dutch looked ill. Ray looked terrified. Tommy looked resigned. And Wyatt looked like a man watching his world crumble. Good. She rode hard back to town, the ring clutched in her palm like evidence of damnation. Sheriff Hoskins was right that it wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of something. Proof that these men had desecrated her mother's resting place for gold and trinkets. Proof that they'd taken everything from her father, even his most sacred memories. That night, Clayton watched from the hills. as Sarah rode away from what had been his ranch. He'd been closer than usual, drawn by reports from trappers that his daughter had returned to Dry Hollow. Part of him wanted to reveal himself, to let her know he lived. But the timing wasn't right. She was in the middle of her own investigation, finding her own path to truth. And he had learned patience from the wolves, learned that timing was everything in a hunt. Ghost stood beside him, the scarred alpha, a familiar presence now. The pack had grown comfortable with Clayton over these months, accepting him as something strange but not threatening. They'd even shared kills with him, allowed him to move through their territory freely. In return, he'd helped drive game toward them when he could, had protected their den when a mountain lion ventured too close. She's strong, like her mother, he said to the wolf, who tilted his head at the sound of his voice. Braver than I gave her credit for. Braver than I was, maybe. She's fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. The wolf made a soft sound. Neither growl nor whine, just acknowledgement of noise. It's almost time, Clayton continued, watching the ranch lights in the distance. They're fracturing. Dutch is breaking, Ray's terrified. Tommy wants to run. Only Wyatt is holding them together, and his grip is weakening. When they break completely, that's when I'll come down. Not before. He'd learned this from the wolves too, patience in the hunt, waiting for the prey to exhaust itself, to make mistakes. The men who'd betrayed him were doing exactly that. Every day they stayed at the ranch was another day of fear and guilt wearing them down. Every day Sarah pressed them was another day closer to complete breakdown. Justice didn't always require violence. Sometimes it just required waiting for evil men to destroy themselves. He turned away from the valley, Ghost following, and made his way back to his cave. Spring was deepening into summer. The time would come soon enough, and when it did, he'd be ready, not as the man who'd been broken, but as something harder, wiser, and infinitely more patient. The wolves howled, and this time Clayton howled with them, his voice joining theirs in a song of wild places and justice deferred but not forgotten. Dutch Mallory hadn't slept properly in 18 months. The nightmares were relentless, Clayton's face in the rain, blood mixing with water, the sound of his ribs cracking under their fists. Every time Dutch closed his eyes, he saw those scenes replay with perfect, terrible clarity. Whiskey helped for a while, but then the dreams bled into his waking hours, and he'd see the old man's ghost standing in doorways, watching from windows. Waiting in shadows, Sarah Baird's visit had broken something in him. Seeing her grief, seeing her determination to find the truth, made him realize what they'd really done. They hadn't just robbed a man. They'd murdered him. Left him to die in the wilderness was murder, no matter what word you used to describe it. And they destroyed his daughter's life in the process, stolen her father, and desecrated her mother's memory. The weight of it was crushing him. 3 days after Sarah's visit, Dutch woke before dawn with a decision made. He would go into the hills and find Clayton's body. He'd bring it back, confess everything to the sheriff, and take whatever punishment came. The guilt was worse than any prison could be. At least in prison, maybe he could sleep. He left the bunkhouse quietly, not wanting to wake the others. Wyatt had been drinking heavily since Sarah's confrontation, alternating between rage and paranoia. Tommy talked constantly about running. Ray just stared at the walls, lost in his own fear. They were all breaking in different ways, and Dutch couldn't carry their sins as well as his own. He rode out as the sun was rising, heading into the high country where they'd thrown Clayton out that terrible night. He had no real plan, just ride until he found something, some sign of what had happened. Maybe the old man had made it a few days before dying. Maybe there'd be bones, scraps of clothing, something he could bring back. The morning was cool, clouds gathering for another spring storm. Dutch pushed higher into the hills, following game trails and his own guilt-driven instincts. Around mid-morning he found a cave partway up the mesa. Something about it felt occupied, felt used. He dismounted, tied his horse, and approached cautiously. Inside, there were clear signs of human habitation. A bed of dried grass and animal skins, tools made from stone and bone, strips of meat drying on rocks, and carved into the cave wall, a tally of marks, Days, maybe, or weeks. Someone had been living here, surviving here, looking for something. The voice came from behind him, calm and measured. Dutch spun around, his hand going for his gun, and froze. Clayton Baird stood at the cave entrance, backlit by morning sun. But not the Clayton that Dutch remembered. This man was lean as a wolf, grey-haired and bearded, dressed in rough deerskin clothing. His eyes were harder than Dutch had ever seen them, but also clearer, more present. And behind him, barely visible in the morning shadows, were wolves. A dozen of them, sitting silent and watching. Dutch's gun cleared leather, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "You're dead. You're supposed to be dead." "I was supposed to be a lot of things," Clayton said, taking a slow step forward. "Rich, respected, a man with friends and legacy. But here I am instead, alive despite your best efforts. We thought—" Dutch's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The wolves were the most unreal part. They sat like trained dogs, but wild, their eyes fixed on him with predatory intensity. "You thought I'd die out here." "I nearly did." Clayton stopped a few feet away. The largest wolf, a massive grey with a scarred face, moved to stand beside him. "But the wilderness is more honest than civilization. It doesn't pretend to be your friend while planning to destroy you. It kills you or it doesn't, but there's no betrayal in it." Dutch lowered his gun, his legs giving out. He collapsed to his knees. "I'm sorry." "God help me, Clayton, I'm so sorry. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. I've been trying to live with it, trying to justify it, but I can't. I can't sleep. I can't think. I see your face every time I close my eyes." "Good," Clayton said simply. "You should. I came up here to find your body, to bring you back, to confess everything." The words poured out of Dutch like poison being drawn from a wound. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know what we did was unforgivable. But I can't carry it anymore. I'll tell the sheriff everything. I'll testify against the others. I'll hang if that's what it takes, but I have to make it right somehow." Clayton studied him for a long moment. "You really mean that?" "Yes, I swear it." "Then answer me this. Why did you do it?" "I gave you work, paid you fair, treated you decent." "Why?" Dutch's face crumpled. "Because it wasn't enough. Because you had everything and we had nothing, and that felt unfair. Wyatt convinced us that you looked down on us, that your kindness was condescension. And I wanted to believe him because it hurt less than admitting I was just jealous of what you'd built, of what you'd been born into." He looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But he was wrong. You were good to us, better than we deserved. And we destroyed you for it." "You tried to destroy me," Clayton corrected. "You failed. And now I'm going to ask you something, and I want the truth. Can your conscience bear one more betrayal? One more lie?" "What do you mean?" Clayton crouched down so they were at eye level. "Wyatt has the forged bill of sale that claims I signed the ranch over. But I know something he doesn't. Years ago, when property disputes were common in this territory, Margaret convinced me to make a backup deed and hide it somewhere only she and I knew. She was afraid something might happen to the papers, afraid of fire or theft. She was always practical that way, always thinking ahead." Dutch's eyes widened. "There's a real deed?" "Hidden beneath a fence post at the western edge of the property. Specific coordinates that Margaret and I memorized. The post has a marker, 3 notches cut at an angle. The deed is in a waterproof case 2 feet down. It proves the ranch is mine, that it always has been mine, and that any sale documented after that date would require witnesses and legal proceedings that never happened." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to help my daughter find it. Not directly. I don't want them to know you're helping. But you know the property. You can leave signs, clues that a smart woman like Sarah can follow. Can you do that?" Yes, I can do that, but why? Why trust me after what I did?" Clayton stood and the wolves rose with him. "Because you're here, aren't you? You came looking for my body so you could make things right. That counts for something. Not forgiveness, I'm not ready for that, and I don't know if I ever will be. But it counts for something." He paused. "And because I need an ally inside, someone who can help me time this right. I'm coming back, Dutch, soon. But when I do, I need all the pieces in place. The wolves, Dutch's voice shook as he looked at the pack surrounding Clayton. They'll come with me. I've lived among them for 18 months. They know me, trust me in their way, and they understand loyalty better than any human I've met. Clayton's smile was grim. When I walk into Dry Hollow with a wolf pack at my back, people are going to listen. They're going to pay attention. And the men who betrayed me are going to understand exactly what kind of predator they tried to destroy. Wyatt won't go easy. He's got too much to lose now. I'm counting on that. I don't want easy. I want him to see me standing there, alive and strong, with everything he tried to take being taken back. I want him to feel what I felt when you threw me out into that storm, helpless, betrayed, and knowing that everything he built his new life on was a lie. Clayton's voice was hard as stone. But I don't want revenge through violence. I want it through truth, through the law, through watching him realize that his own evil has destroyed him more thoroughly than I ever could. Dutch nodded slowly. The deed. I'll help Sarah find it. I'll make sure she has what she needs. One more thing, Clayton said. When the time comes, when everything breaks open, you need to decide which side you're on. You can stand with Wyatt and share his punishment, or you can stand with truth and maybe find some redemption. But you only get one choice, and you make it when it matters most. Understand? I understand. Clayton stepped back and the wolves parted to let Dutch pass. As Dutch stumbled back to his horse, his mind reeling, he heard Clayton's voice one more time. Dutch, thank you for coming up here, for trying to make it right. That took courage, even if it came late. Dutch didn't trust himself to speak. He just mounted his horse and rode down the mountain, tears streaming freely now, a strange mix of terror and relief flooding through him. Clayton was alive. The nightmare wasn't over. In some ways it was just beginning. But maybe, just maybe, there was a path through it that didn't end with him being completely lost. Behind him, Clayton watched him go, then turned to Ghost. He'll help. He's broken enough to need redemption, and that makes him useful. The wolf made a low sound, and Clayton nodded. I know it's manipulation, using his guilt as a weapon. Not exactly honorable. He looked out over the valley where his ranch lay, where men who'd tried to murder him were slowly destroying themselves with their own fear and guilt. But I've learned something from you and your pack, old friend. In nature, there's no such thing as fair. There's only survival. And I plan to survive this. The clouds opened up, rain beginning to fall. Just like the night of betrayal. But this time Clayton wasn't running from it. This time he was standing firm, a pack of wolves at his side, and plans forming that would bring justice. Cold, inevitable, and complete. The hunt was entering its final phase. The prey was weakening, making mistakes. And the predator was ready to strike, not with tooth and claw, but with something more devastating, the truth, backed by witnesses and law, and the simple fact of his impossible survival. Spring rain washed over him, and Clayton let it come, baptism and benediction both, washing away the last remnants of the man who'd been betrayed and preparing him for the man who'd returned to claim what was stolen soon, very soon now. Sarah had been visiting her mother's grave every morning since finding the wedding ring. The small cemetery at the edge of Dry Hollow had been Margaret Baird's final resting place for 5 years, and Sarah liked to think her mother would appreciate the irony. Even in death, Margaret was closest to the town she'd helped build, not isolated on the ranch she'd called home. This morning, as she knelt to place fresh wildflowers on the grave, she noticed something strange. The grass was trampled in a particular pattern, leading away from the plot, heading west. Not the normal foot traffic of mourners, but something deliberate. And there, caught on a nearby fence post, was a scrap of cloth that looked like it had been deliberately placed, yellow cotton, bright enough to catch the eye. Sarah stood, following the trail. The cloth led her to another marker, this one a stone, painted with a white mark. Then another, and another, a breadcrumb path heading toward the western edge of her father's property. Someone was leaving her signs. Someone wanted her to follow. She returned to town, collected her horse, and told no one where she was going. If this was a trap, she'd deal with it. If it was help, she needed to see where it led. Either way, the waiting was over. The trail took her across familiar terrain, land she'd ridden as a child before Denver, before her mother's death, before everything fractured. She found herself remembering summers here, helping with the branding, learning to rope from her father's patient instruction. He'd been different then, less closed off, more present. Or maybe she'd been too young to notice his emotional distance. In her saddlebag, she carried something she'd found while sorting through her own belongings at the boarding house. A letter she'd written to her father 3 years ago, but never sent. It had been composed during a particularly difficult moment, when the weight of their strained relationship felt unbearable. She'd poured everything into it, her love, her forgiveness for his emotional withdrawal after her mother's death, her understanding that grief made people strangers even to themselves. She'd never sent it because words on paper felt inadequate, and she'd kept hoping for the right moment to visit, to say these things in person. Now that moment would never come, but she kept the letter anyway, a reminder of what she'd wanted to tell him, a reminder of the connection they'd almost rebuilt before it was stolen forever. The markers led her to the western fence line, a section she barely remembered. The property stretched so far that even growing up here, she'd never explored every corner of it. But as she approached, she saw what the trail had been leading to, a fence post with 3 notches cut at an angle, distinctive and deliberate. She dismounted, examined the post. The notches were old, weathered, but clear, and the ground at its base looked disturbed, as if something had been buried and recently marked. She had no shovel, but she used a flat rock and her hands, digging carefully. 2 feet down, her fingers hit something solid, a metal box carefully sealed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a document. She unfolded it with trembling hands and read the precise legal language of a property deed, dated 15 years earlier, signed by her father and notarized by a judge who'd since passed away. The original deed to the Baird Ranch, filed officially with the county, but also hidden here as her mother's practical mind had surely insisted. This was proof. This was everything. Tears blurred her vision as she read her father's careful signature, her mother's witness mark. This document proved ownership in a way the Outlaws' forged papers never could. With this, she could reclaim her family's legacy. With this, she could force the truth into the light, but as she refolded the deed, a sound made her look up. Dutch Mallory sat on his horse 30 yards away, watching her. Her hand went to the small pistol in her jacket pocket, but he raised his hands, showing they were empty. "I'm not here to hurt you," he called out. "I'm the one who left the markers." "Why?" Her voice was sharp, untrusting. "Because you deserve the truth. Because what we did was wrong, and I can't live with it anymore." He dismounted slowly, carefully, making no threatening moves. "That deed proves the ranch is your father's. The papers Wyatt has are forgeries. We stole everything from your father, Miss Baird. We beat him and threw him out into that storm, and he probably died alone in those hills because of what we did." Sarah's hand tightened on the deed. "Tell me exactly what happened that night," he did. Every terrible detail, his voice breaking multiple times. The confrontation, the beating, the theft of the watch and gun, the way they'd laughed as they threw Clayton out into the wilderness. Sarah listened with growing horror, her free hand pressed to her mouth to keep from crying out. When he finished, Dutch looked at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. "I know I don't deserve mercy. I know I should hang for what we did. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to have what you need to make this right. Where is my father's body?" The words came out cold, hard. "I don't know. I went looking for it to bring it back, but I couldn't find it. The wilderness is vast, and animals—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah carefully placed the deed in her saddlebag. "I'm going to the sheriff with this. I'm going to tell him everything you just told me. You'll be arrested, I know." Dutch looked up at her finally. "I'm ready for that. It's time. Why should I believe this sudden conscience of yours is real? How do I know this isn't another trick? You don't, but that deed is real, and I'll testify to everything we did. Wyatt, Tommy, Ray, and me, we're all guilty. We all deserve to pay." He mounted his horse. I can't give you your father back. I can't undo what we did, but I can make sure the truth comes out, and I can face the consequences. That's all I have left to offer." He rode away before she could respond, leaving her standing by the fence post with her family's legacy in her hands and confirmation of her worst fears weighing on her heart. Her father hadn't gone mad. He'd been murdered by men he'd trusted, men he'd tried to help. The grief hit her fresh and sharp, as if the loss had just happened. But beneath the grief was something else, a fierce determination. She had the truth now. She had the evidence. And she would see justice done, not just for her father, but for every person who'd ever been betrayed by someone they'd tried to help. Sheriff Hoskins was in his office when she arrived, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something had broken open. She laid the deed on his desk, told him everything Dutch had said, watched the sheriff's expression harden into something cold and final. "I've been waiting for this," Hoskins said quietly. "Hoping for it, actually. Because I knew those boys were lying, and I knew your father didn't deserve what they claimed happened to him." He stood, buckled on his gun belt with deliberate care. "I'm going to need deputies, good men who can't be intimidated, and I'm going to need you to stay here, stay safe while we handle this." "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "I'm going with you. He was my father. I have a right to be there when you arrest them. It could be dangerous. Wyatt's desperate, and desperate men do foolish things. I don't care." "I'm going." Hoskins studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay behind us, and if shooting starts, you get to cover. Understood?" "Understood." The sheriff spent the next 2 hours gathering men he trusted, ranchers who'd known Clayton, businessmen who'd been cheated by the Outlaws, even the minister who'd performed Clayton and Margaret's wedding ceremony. By late afternoon, 8 men stood ready, armed and determined, the weight of justice settling on their shoulders. They rode out as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a spring tempest moving in fast. Sarah found herself thinking about the letter in her saddlebag, the words she'd never gotten to share with her father. She wondered if he'd died, knowing she loved him, understanding that she'd forgiven his emotional distance. She hoped he had. She prayed he'd found some peace in his final moments, even if those moments were alone and cold and filled with the pain of betrayal. On the mesa above the valley, Clayton stood with his wolf pack and watched the group ride toward his ranch. He recognized Sarah even from this distance, recognized the sheriff's steady posture. They'd found the deed. Dutch had kept his word. The pieces were moving into their final positions, and the timing was perfect. Another storm approaching, just like the night of his betrayal. The symmetry was almost poetic. "It's time," he said to Ghost, who sat beside him, the scarred alpha's eyes fixed on the valley below. "Time to finish this." The pack stirred, sensing his intent. They'd followed him for 18 months, accepted him into their territory, shared their kills and their loyalty. They would follow him one more time, down into the human world, into the confrontation that would end this long hunt. Clayton picked up his walking staff, worn smooth from constant use, marked with the passage of days and seasons. He wore the clothes he'd made from deer hide, his hair long and grey, his beard thick and wild. He looked like something from an old story, a figure from the territory's rougher past. He looked like a man the wilderness had remade into something harder and more honest. The storm broke as he began his descent, rain hammering down just as it had that terrible night. But this time he walked into it with purpose and power, a wolf pack at his heels and truth on his side. This time the storm was his ally, his witness, his baptism into the final confrontation. Below, in the ranch house, Wyatt stood at the window and saw something impossible, a figure emerging from the hills, moving through the rain, with wolves flowing around him like shadows given form. For a moment, Wyatt thought he was hallucinating, that the guilt and whiskey had finally broken his mind. Then lightning flashed, and in that stark white light, he saw the face. Older, harder, changed, but unmistakable, Clayton Baird, walking toward the ranch he'd been thrown from 18 months ago. walking home with the wilderness itself following in his wake. Wyatt's glass slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor, whiskey spreading like blood, and he knew with absolute certainty that everything he'd stolen was about to be taken back. Dawn came slow through the storm, a grey, reluctant light that revealed what the darkness had hidden. Wyatt hadn't slept, had spent the night drinking and pacing and trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was imagination, nothing more. But when the first pale light touched the ranch yard, he looked out and knew the nightmare was real. The wolves sat in a perfect ring around the property, maybe 20 of them, silent as stones. They didn't move, didn't howl, just sat watching the house with eyes that caught the weak morning light and threw it back like gold coins. The sight was impossible, terrifying. Something from old stories his grandmother used to tell about the wild places and the things that lived there. And at the main gate, standing alone but utterly commanding, was Clayton Baird. He looked like a spirit of the wilderness itself. Grey hair pulled back, beard thick and wild, wearing clothes made from animal hide. The walking staff in his hand seemed to grow from the earth itself, an extension of the wild places he'd survived in. But it was his eyes that held Wyatt frozen, clear, hard, filled with a certainty that made Wyatt's whiskey courage evaporate like morning mist. "Wyatt," Clayton called out, his voice carrying across the yard despite the rain. "I believe we have unfinished business." Behind Wyatt, Dutch, Tommy and Ray scrambled into the room, their faces pale with shock and fear. Ray was shaking so badly he could barely stand. Tommy kept whispering prayers under his breath. Only Dutch seemed unsurprised, and the guilt on his face told Wyatt everything he needed to know. "You knew," Wyatt hissed. "You knew he was alive?" "I found out a few days ago," Dutch said quietly. "I went looking for his body. Found him instead. And you didn't tell us?" Wyatt's hand went to his gun. "You betrayed us?" "I betrayed him," Dutch corrected, nodding toward Clayton. "Telling you would have just been one more betrayal on top of that one. I'm done with betrayal." Wyatt's mind raced, trying to find an angle, a way out. "He's just one man. The 4 of us can take him. We have guns." You have nothing," Clayton called out, taking a slow step forward. The wolves remained motionless, but their attention focused like a physical force. "You have stolen property and forged documents and 18 months of living a lie. What you don't have is any way to make this end well for yourselves. You're dead," Wyatt shouted, stepping out onto the porch. "You were supposed to die!" "I was supposed to do a lot of things." Clayton took another step forward, his voice calm, measured, like he was discussing the weather rather than confronting men who'd tried to murder him. "I was supposed to trust you, supposed to believe that kindness was returned with loyalty, supposed to die alone in those hills, unmourned and forgotten." Another step. "But here's what I learned instead. I learned that betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. I learned that wolves are more honest than men. And I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what actually matters." The wolves shifted, a ripple of movement through the pack. Wyatt's hand closed on his gun grip, but he couldn't quite draw it. The psychological weight of what he was seeing, impossible Clayton, alive and strong, with wild animals responding to him like trained dogs, paralyzed him. "I gave you everything I had," Clayton continued, still advancing with that slow, inevitable pace. "Taught you skills, paid you fairly, treated you like family. And you repaid that with violence and theft. You took my home, my possessions, my family legacy. You even dug up my wife's grave to steal her wedding ring." His voice hardened. "You want to know what evil looks like? Look in a mirror. We were poor." Wyatt finally found his voice, rage breaking through fear. "We had nothing while you had everything. You with your inherited land and your family name, looking down on us. I never looked down on you. That was your own shame talking, your own inadequacy." Clayton stopped 20 feet away. "But I'll admit my failures too. I was distant after Margaret died. I buried myself in work rather than dealing with grief. Maybe I was too generous in ways that felt like pity instead of genuine care. I'm not perfect, Wyatt, never claimed to be. Then what's the difference between us?" Wyatt's voice cracked. "If you're flawed and we're flawed, The difference, Clayton said softly, is that my flaws hurt myself. Your flaws hurt everyone around you. That's the line between imperfection and evil. That's the line you crossed. Behind Clayton, more figures appeared through the rain. Sheriff Hoskins on horseback, deputies flanking him. And there, riding between them with her head high despite the storm, was Sarah. She held something in her hands, papers, documents, and when she looked at the house, at the men who destroyed her father, her expression was iron. The law is here, Clayton said, and my daughter has proof that this ranch is mine, always was mine, and that your claim to it is fraud. He finally looked directly at Wyatt. This is where you choose, all of you. Surrender peacefully, confess to what you did, and face justice. Or run and spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders. Wyatt's hand was still on his gun. One draw, one shot, and maybe this nightmare would end. Maybe he could still salvage something from the wreckage. As if reading his mind, Ghost rose from his sitting position. The massive scarred wolf took 3 steps forward, positioned himself between Clayton and the house, and growled. It was a sound from the earth's deep places, a promise of violence that made every nerve in Wyatt's body scream warnings. Behind Ghost, every wolf in the pack tensed, ready to spring. Wyatt's hand fell away from his gun. Whatever courage whiskey had given him died in the face of that primal threat. Smart choice, Clayton said. He turned to the Winchester rifle mounted above the door, his father's rifle, taken from this house 18 months ago. I'll be taking that back now, not to use, just to reclaim what's mine. Sheriff Hoskins dismounted with the careful deliberation of a man who'd done this too many times before. He pulled the deed from Sarah's hands, held it up where everyone could see. This is the original property deed for the Baird Ranch, filed legally with the county 15 years ago. It proves Clayton Baird is the rightful owner of this land. Any documents claiming otherwise are fraudulent. That's impossible, Wyatt said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd known, somewhere deep down, that this moment would come, that lies eventually collapsed under their own weight. It's not only possible, it's fact. And Dutch Mallory has provided a full confession regarding what happened the night you threw Clayton out into that storm. Hoskins' hand rested on his gun. You're all under arrest for assault, theft, fraud, and attempted murder. You have the right to surrender peacefully. Tommy Vickers stepped forward immediately, hands raised. I surrender. I'm done with this. I was wrong, and I'll take whatever punishment comes. Ray Sutton followed, tears streaming down his face, barely able to stand. Me too. God forgive me. I'll confess to everything. But Wyatt stood frozen, watching his entire world disintegrate. All those months of fear, all that guilt and paranoia, and for what? Clayton was alive. The deed proved ownership. His own men were abandoning him. There was nothing left but rage and desperate pride. No, he said, voice rising. No, this isn't right. This isn't fair. He lunged forward, not toward Clayton, but toward Sarah. Some animal instinct telling him that a hostage might change the mathematics of the situation. But he'd only taken 2 steps when Dutch crashed into him from the side, both men going down hard in the mud. I'm done following you, Dutch shouted, pinning Wyatt down. Done letting you justify evil. We did wrong, Wyatt. Wrong that can't be explained away. They struggled, Dutch fighting to hold him, Wyatt fighting for freedom that was already lost. Finally, 2 deputies pulled them apart, hauling Wyatt to his feet. His hat had fallen off, and his face was streaked with mud and rain and something that might have been tears. You had everything. Wyatt screamed at Clayton, all pretense of control gone. Everything handed to you. Your grandfather's land, your father's herds, a good wife, a daughter, respect. You never had to fight for any of it. Men like me, we get nothing. We scrape and struggle and still end up with nothing, while men like you live in comfort. Clayton walked closer, the wolves parting to let him through. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but cut through Wyatt's ravings like a blade. You're right that I was born into advantages you weren't. That's true. But abundance isn't theft, Wyatt. Having more than you doesn't mean I took something from you. He paused, letting the words sink in. But what you did, that was theft. What you did was betrayal of trust, violence against someone who tried to help you. Don't confuse your envy with justice. Don't pretend your evil was somehow righteous because I had what you wanted. I deserved it more than you. You would have run it into the ground, which is exactly what you've been doing. Clayton's moral clarity was devastating in its simplicity. You didn't want to build something. You wanted to take what someone else built. That's not ambition. That's just greed wearing a victim's mask. Wyatt made one final desperate move, jerking a knife from his belt, the same knife Clayton had given him years ago as a gift, its handle carved with Wyatt's initials. He lunged forward, the blade aimed at Clayton's chest, a wordless howl of rage and despair tearing from his throat. Ghost moved faster than thought. The scarred alpha was suddenly there, positioning himself between Clayton and Wyatt, teeth bared, a growl that promised death. Wyatt stumbled backward, the knife falling from his nerveless fingers to land in the mud. The entire wolf pack tensed, ready to spring, and Wyatt finally understood what Clayton had become, not just a man, but something the wilderness had accepted as its own. "It's over," Clayton said softly. "It was over the moment you threw me out. You just didn't know it yet." Sheriff Hoskins moved forward with iron restraints, snapping them onto Wyatt's wrists with practiced efficiency. "Wyatt Crenshaw, you're under arrest. Same charges as the others, plus attempted assault on a lawman's witness." He looked at the other three. "Tommy Ray, get over here. Dutch, you too. You'll all be held in Dry Hollow Jail pending trial." Dutch met Clayton's eyes as the restraints closed on his wrists. "I'm sorry," he said again. "For what little that's worth." "It's worth something," Clayton acknowledged. "Sheriff, I'd like to request that you consider Dutch's cooperation when it comes to sentencing. He came forward when he didn't have to. He helped my daughter find the evidence we needed. That should count for something." "I'll make note of it," Hoskins said. "But he still committed serious crimes. He'll face consequences." "I know," Dutch said. "I'm ready for that." As the deputies led the four men away, Clayton turned back to the house. His house! He walked inside, seeing how they'd lived in it, the damage and disrespect done to a place that had held 3 generations of memories. But it was still standing, still salvageable. He found his grandfather's pocket watch in a drawer, the silver tarnished but intact. Found his father's engraved Colt revolver mounted on the wall like a trophy. And most importantly, found Margaret's wedding ring in a box of stolen jewelry. He held it for a long moment, remembering her hands, her smile, her practical wisdom that had prompted her to hide that backup deed. Sarah appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Father?" He turned, and for the first time since the betrayal, felt tears threaten. His daughter, who'd fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, who'd refused to believe the lies, who'd risked everything to find the truth. "Sarah," he crossed to her, held out the ring. "Your mother would want you to have this. She loved you more than anything in this world. So do I." Sarah took the ring, her own tears falling freely now. "I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you forever. You almost did. But I found my way back." He pulled her into an embrace, the first real physical contact they'd had in years. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you after your mother died. Sorry I closed myself off instead of sharing the grief. You're here now," she whispered. "That's what matters." Outside, the wolves were moving toward the hills. Their work was done. Ghost stood at the edge of the property, looking back at Clayton with those intelligent golden eyes. Clayton gently released Sarah and walked out to face the Alpha one last time. He knelt in the mud, meeting the wolf's gaze at eye level. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved my life. Taught me what real loyalty looks like. I'll never forget that." Ghost made a soft sound, almost affectionate, then turned and loped toward the high country. The pack followed, flowing like shadows back into the wilderness where they belonged. Clayton watched until they disappeared into the morning mist, feeling something like grief at their departure, but understanding it was right. They'd given him what he needed. Now they were returning to their true home, wild and free and honest. He stood, feeling the weight of civilization settling back onto his shoulders. It felt strange after 18 months of wilderness survival, but not unwelcome. He was home, finally, truly home. 1 month after that storm-soaked dawn, the Baird ranch was beginning to look like itself again. Clayton stood on the porch in the early morning, the same porch where 18 months ago he'd faced betrayal, and watched the sun paint the valley in shades of gold. Fences were mended now, straight and strong. The barn had fresh paint. Cattle grazed in proper pastures, their numbers carefully counted and recorded. The work was far from finished, but the direction was clear. Restoration, renewal, reclamation of what had been nearly destroyed. Sarah emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, handed one to him. They stood together in companionable silence, something that would have been impossible before. The distance that had grown between them after Margaret's death was finally healing. Conversation by careful conversation, shared work day by shared work day. "I was thinking," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "about what happens after we get this place running properly again. Denver feels far away now. The school there, the life I built, it all seems like someone else's memory. You thinking of staying?" Clayton kept his voice neutral, not wanting to pressure her, but hope bloomed in his chest. "I am. If you'd have me, not as a guest, but as a partner. I want to learn the ranch the way you and grandfather and great-grandfather knew it. I want to be part of the legacy," she smiled. "Besides, someone needs to keep you from working yourself into an early grave again." Clayton laughed, the sound still unfamiliar after so many months of wilderness silence. "I'd like that. Like it more than I can say." They'd spent the past month working together, and in that work, they'd finally found the conversations that grief had stolen from them. Clayton had admitted his failures, how he'd withdrawn after Margaret's death, buried himself in ranch work rather than sharing the loss with his daughter. How his emotional distance had hurt her in ways he'd been too stubborn or too broken to see. Sarah had forgiven him with grace that reminded him achingly of her mother. Explained that she'd understood even then, that people handle grief differently, that his silence wasn't rejection, but survival. She'd shown him the letter she'd written years ago, but never sent, the one expressing her love and forgiveness. And they'd both cried over words that arrived late but still mattered. The community had returned too, slowly at first, then with growing warmth. Ranchers who'd known Clayton for decades came by to welcome him back, to offer help with repairs, to express their relief that justice had been served. Shop owners in Dry Hollow extended credit without question. The minister had visited to pray with him, though Clayton had found his spirituality had shifted towards something more primal during his wilderness months, less about churches and more about the honest brutality and beauty of nature itself. New ranch hands had been hired, younger men, carefully vetted this time, who'd heard the story and approached the work with a kind of reverence. They called him Sir and listened when he taught them, understanding that they were learning from a man who'd survived the impossible and emerged harder but not cruel, damaged but not broken. The sound of hooves drew their attention. Sheriff Hoskins rode up, dismounting with a nod. "Morning, Clayton. Sarah thought you'd want to hear the sentences came down yesterday." Clayton gestured to a chair. "Tell me." Wyatt got 20 years. Judge said it was attempted murder, theft, fraud, and he showed no remorse during trial. "He'll be an old man when he gets out, if he survives prison." Hoskins paused. "Tommy and Ray got 8 years each. They cooperated, showed genuine remorse, and the judge took that into account. And Dutch, 5 years, with recommendation for parole after 3 based on his cooperation and your testimony about his help." Hoskins studied Clayton's face. "You argued for leniency for all of them." Judge listened, "But there's only so much mercy the law can give when crimes are that severe." Clayton nodded slowly, his feelings about the sentences complex and tangled. He felt no satisfaction in their imprisonment, no joy in their suffering. But he recognized the necessity of consequences, understood that society needed some structure of justice, or it would collapse into chaos. The wilderness had taught him about natural law, eat or be eaten, survive or die. But he was no longer a creature of wilderness. He was a man living among men, and that required different rules, different approaches to wrongdoing. "It's fair," he finally said. "More than fair, maybe. They chose their path, and now they walk it. I hope they find some redemption in those years. Hope they learn what I learned, that you can survive almost anything if you're willing to change." After the sheriff left, Clayton pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch. He'd taken it to the jeweler in Cheyenne, had it cleaned and repaired, the mechanism restored so it kept perfect time again. The silver gleamed now, catching the morning light, and when he opened it, he could hear the steady tick of seconds passing, time moving forward as it always had, indifferent to human suffering or joy. "Your mother wanted you to have this when the time was right," he said, handing the watch to Sarah. 3 generations of Bairds carried this west, built a life with it marking the hours. Now it's yours, 4th generation. May you carry it with more wisdom than I did. Sarah accepted it with reverent hands, understanding the weight of legacy she was receiving. "I'll care for it. For all of it, the watch, the ranch, the family name. I promise." Evening found them on the porch again, after a day of hard work branding calves and mending fence. The sun was setting in spectacular fashion, the sky ablaze with orange and purple. In the distance, barely audible, came a sound that made Clayton smile. Wolves howling in the high country. Ghost and his pack, still out there, still surviving, still living according to their own honest laws. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked. "The wilderness. Living with the wolves." "Sometimes," Clayton admitted. "But I learned what I needed to learn. The wolves taught me about loyalty. Real loyalty, not the kind that's spoken, but the kind that's lived. They taught me that survival isn't shameful, that adapting isn't weakness, that sometimes you have to become something new to endure." He looked at his daughter. "But they also taught me that I'm human, that my place is here, with my own kind, building things that last beyond one lifetime. What's the most important thing you learned?" Clayton thought for a long moment, watching the sun slip below the western hills. "That respect can't be taken by force or trickery. It can only be earned by living with honor, even when you're broken. Especially when you're broken. That's when character really shows, not in success, but in how you handle betrayal and loss." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, a gesture that felt natural now, where it would have been awkward before. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, and somewhere in that darkness, wolves sang their ancient songs. "The wilderness taught me that packs survive through loyalty," Clayton said softly. "We forgot that here among our own kind. Forgot that trust has to be earned and kept, not demanded or assumed. But maybe we can remember again. Maybe we can build something here that's worthy of the legacy we've been given." "We will," Sarah said with quiet certainty. Together, peace settled over Dry Hollow like the gentle night, not the peace of everything being perfect, but the deeper peace of things being right. The ranch would continue. The Baird legacy would grow into its 4th generation. And somewhere in the high country, wolves ran free under the same stars that watched over the valley. Wild and honest and true. Clayton checked the watch one last time before heading inside. 9:30, time moving forward, never back. And that was as it should be. The past held lessons and pain and memories, both bitter and sweet. But the future held possibility, redemption, and the promise of tomorrow, built on the hard-won wisdom of yesterday. He smiled, grateful for second chances, for stubborn daughters, for wilderness that taught and didn't coddle, for wolves that understood loyalty better than men. Grateful, ultimately, for the chance to learn that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about how you rebuild yourself when everything you thought you were gets stripped away. The door closed behind them, warm light spilling from the windows. The Baird ranch stood solid against the night, a testament to 3 generations past, and at least one more to come, enduring as the land endured. Strong as the bonds between people who chose loyalty over convenience, truth over comfort, and honor over ease. In the distance, one last wolf howl rose up, Ghost's distinctive voice calling across the darkness. Clayton heard it, understood it for the blessing it was, and whispered his own reply into the night, a thank you, a farewell, and a promise that what he'd learned would not be forgotten. Then he turned to face the future, his daughter beside him, and knew that some stories end not with triumph or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of having survived, having learned, and having found your way home.